Endocrine disruptors. What are they? Where do they come from? And how do they impact your weight and your health? I'm Corey Applin, and this is Compound Action: How Small Steps Create Massive Change. Endocrine disruptors are chemicals that interfere with the endocrine system, which regulates hormones responsible for growth, metabolism, reproduction, and other essential functions. These chemicals can mimic a hormone, meaning your body thinks the chemical is the actual hormone. They can block other hormones from either being produced or functioning properly, or alter hormone signals. So the hormone remains the same, but the signal it sends to your body is wrong. And all of these things can lead to various health issues, including obesity. So, what are some of the more common endocrine disruptors and where do they come from? Bisphenol A, commonly known as BPA, is found in plastics, and primary exposure is going to come from food containers and water bottles. But really, they're finding microplastics everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere they look, even in our drinking water. This is really a pervasive and worsening issue. Microplastics are now being found in essentially every organ in the human body. And new evidence is showing that 0.5% of our brain is made up of plastics due to this chronic exposure to these chemicals, including the endocrine disruptors. So it's a big issue, definitely something we want to give attention to. Another area of exposure would be through phthalates, which are also used in plastics to increase flexibility. And a lot of people have heard of phthalates already. They know they're in plastics, but what a lot of people may not know is they're used in personal care products, lotions, makeup, skin creams, hair products, those types of things. So you really have to be careful what you're putting on your body. These things absorb, and what you put on your body ends up in your body. Another area of potential exposure would be through PCBs. These are polychlorinated bisphenols, which are from industrial chemicals. Now, these ones have been banned since the 70s. So how can you still be exposed to them? Well, there's still environmental exposure. So if a lake is polluted with PCBs, you catch a fish from that lake and you eat it, you've been exposed. There's also dioxins, which are byproducts of industrial processes. There's pesticides, which can disrupt endocrine function. And then there's naturally occurring disruptors, the most common example being phytoestrogens in soy. They mimic estrogen, so eating high amounts can affect reproductive health. Now, I worry about this especially in younger women who are still developing, especially with like the rise of infertility and the role that these types of phytoestrogens may play. Which brings me to, how do endocrine disruptors affect health? Well, they can affect reproductive issues. Endocrine disruptors are linked to infertility, reduced sperm count, and menstrual irregularities. They can affect fetal and infant development. Certain disruptors may even impact brain development, especially when exposure occurs early childhood or prenatal stages. Also, hormonal cancers like breast cancer, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, and thyroid cancers have been linked to endocrine disruptors. And maybe the most common problem is their effect on metabolism. Some disruptors are linked to weight gain, insulin resistance, and increased risk of obesity. There's a whole subset of endocrine disruptors called obesogens that specifically make someone gain weight completely independent of how much they eat or how much they exercise. More on that here in a minute. But what's important to know is these disruptions can occur at very low doses, particularly concerning during pregnancy, infancy, or puberty, when hormonal changes are critical for development. I mean, we're letting our teenagers go off to school, eat whatever garbage they're serving, drink the soda out of the plastic bottles. Who knows what the long-term outcomes are going to be 20 years from now? We can already kind of guess at the direction this is going just by looking at the timeline over the last 100 years. These chemicals, they've been in use since the early 1900s. And by the 1950s, scientists were already suspecting that some of these compounds might interfere with hormones. Fast forward to the 1980s, and a study found that sperm count had reduced in men by 50% over a 50-year period, only in industrialized countries. And they hypothesized that it was related to exposure to endocrine disruptors that reduce testosterone production. Now, around that same time, breast cancer rates began to rise, with studies suggesting potential links to estrogen mimicking disruptors like BPA and certain pesticides. Higher levels of BPA and phthalates have been detected in women with PCOS. Now, PCOS is affecting fertility in 5 to 10% of women worldwide, with some studies suggesting that BPA exposure can increase PCOS risk by 70%. And that's a wild number. I mean, even an increased risk by 5 or 10% is significant. So 70% is just off the charts. There's also linked to endocrine disruptors and thyroid problems, including hypothyroidism and thyroid cancers. Some estimates right now suggest that endocrine disruptors are responsible for about 20% of unexplained fertility cases in Western countries. This is fueling the fertility crisis the world is currently in. Obesity rates have skyrocketed, with more than 650 million adults classified as obese worldwide. Obesogens, that subclass of endocrine disruptors coming from phthalates, BPAs, and certain pesticides, are thought to be significant contributors to the obesity epidemic by altering metabolism and promoting fat storage. Obesity rates in the US rose from just 15% in 1980 to 42% by 2020. Now, obesogens are wild because they totally wreak havoc on metabolism. They can disrupt appetite, so either you feel hungrier or when you eat, you don't feel full. They can alter the body's energy expenditure by slowing down metabolism, causing the body to store fat instead of burn it. Obesogens can lead to insulin resistance, causing more glucose to be stored as fat, and also linked to other metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes. They can cause changes in gut bacteria, contributing to weight gain. And obesogens can even increase the number of fat cells in your body, which typically aren't supposed to change that much as an adult. Or they can make existing fat cells larger, leading to greater fat storage. The biggest lie I think that people have been led to believe is that to lose weight and get healthy, all you have to do is eat less and exercise more. And those aren't bad things. Certainly, sugary and processed foods play a role, but there's millions of people out there who are already eating pretty healthy. They're already exercising regularly, and they still have a problem with their weight and their health. That model only works well under ideal conditions where we aren't exposed to all these chemicals, but we are, and we have been for decades. And it certainly doesn't seem like it's going to fix itself. In fact, our exposure is getting worse in many cases. So what can someone do to actually mitigate their exposure? First and foremost would be to remove plastics from your world, at least from the world of things that enter your mouth. Water bottles, plates, containers, cups, silverware. Instead, use glass, ceramic, and metal. Second would be opting for organic foods that haven't been exposed to pesticides. Third is choosing personal care products with fewer synthetic ingredients. I mean, reading the labels on skincare products is just as important as reading food labels. And there's plenty of sites out there that are specifically focused on this one thing. A Google search will show you all the safe products versus the products that are full of chemicals. And fourth, probably the most insidious of them, is to avoid products with the term fragrance. We've been led to believe that fragrance just means how something smells. But with fragrance, it allows companies to use chemicals like phthalates, for example, without listing them on the label. Fragrance is considered proprietary information, so they don't have to disclose which chemicals they're using. So does that mean that every product that has fragrance contains phthalates? No, it just means you have no way to know for sure. So best to avoid when possible. And I know this might seem like a lot because exposure is coming from everywhere. You know, most countries have guidelines for exposure to these chemicals. And in isolation, those guidelines might work. But when you're getting a little bit from your water, a little bit from your food, a little bit from the air you breathe, a little bit from your personal care products, how much of a little do you have to stack up before it becomes a lot? When you take a step back, it's not so surprising that America's in the health crisis that it's in today. I think there's too much money in it, too many lobbyists that influence policy to trust the government to fix this for us. Taking personal accountability for what goes on or in our body is the only way to mitigate the impact. Even just the four things I mentioned can substantially reduce exposure. So start there. Small steps to create massive change. That's today's episode. Thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you on the next one.